Hi, and welcome to Chapter 29, Learning Objective 7, where we're going to talk about the three tools that the Fed uses to control the money supply or monetary policy. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let me get to my slideshow here. There we are. Okay. All right. So, in looking at the three tools, we're going to talk about these and what the effect is on the money supply. So, the Fed's tools of monetary control, basically, the first tool that they use, and all of these have the result of influencing the quantity of reserves that a bank has. So, the Fed does, and the first thing that they do, most used of all of these, is open market operations. This is where the Fed lends to banks, and there's some terminology in here that's somewhat confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it and keep it very clear to you. They can also influence the required reserve ratio. Remember, we used that in the money multiplier, and it was the money multiplier was 1 over the required reserve ratio, which shows how much new money is created through the fractional reserve system. So the first tool that the Fed uses is what we call open market operations. And this one we use most often because it's easy to use. Okay. So to kind of give you a scenario, let's say over here we have households. So I'll draw a little house. And the households have money. And let's use the Fed over here. Okay, so this is the Fed. This is households. Now, it could be domestic citizens or it could be foreign citizens. It doesn't really matter. But here's the purchase and sale of US government bonds. So to increase the money supply, one thing that the Fed could do, I'm going to start with the second one first. So this is the example here. Okay. So a Fed has an IOU, which is just a bond. And what they're doing is this piece of paper they're going to give to households. In return, households are going to give the Fed money. So you can see how that would lead to a reduction in the money supply, right? So if the Fed sells government bonds, that's one way that they reduce the money supply. Okay, to increase the money supply, now we want to change up our example a little bit. Again, we're going to put households over here, and we're going to put the Fed over here. And here, the difference is when the Fed has, let me just get this right here. It's hard to draw, talk, and write at the same time. It's crazy. Okay, so here, the household owns a bond, an IOU, okay, and the Fed has money. So the Fed uses term auction facilities. We'll talk about those in just a moment. So the Fed buys bonds, and I should change my arrows up here. Well, like I said, it's sometimes hard to talk, especially if you had a stroke like I have. So it's hard to talk, draw, and write all at the same time, but we're going to get there. Okay, so the Fed does an auction facility, and they say, hey, we have these bonds for sale. Do you want to buy them? And some households will say, sure, I need the cash now. So they will sell their IOUs to the Fed. The Fed will in turn provide money. And so that's why it will increase the money supply. This is the most used tool out of the three. Okay, there are some additional tools. There used to just be three, but now there's some additional ones. But we're getting a little deeper into open market operations. So the Fed can actually lend to banks. That's one way that they can do it. And they do so through the discount window. So what they do is, this is at what we call the discount rate. And the discount rate is what the Fed charges. It's the Fed interest to a bank. Okay? And they do so through a term auction facility. And what that allows us to do is, after the economic collapse of 2008, we came up with these term auction facilities, or TAF, and the Fed then can provide long-term funds to a broader range of financial intermediaries, not just banks. and a broader range of collateral. So this is where, for example, the Fed might go to chemical and say, how about we give you a loan, okay, against your outstanding loans? So it's kind of strange. So if chemical has some loans that they have on their books, then they could transfer those loans to the Fed, even though you're still paying it through chemical, but the Fed then is going to turn around and pay interest on the loans that they are securing as collateral. Now again, this discount rate, the discount rate is the rate on loans from the Fed to banks. So here's the idea. We have the Bank of Chicago, again, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and they're going to provide a loan to chemical. Okay, the higher this discount rate, then the lower the money supply, because again, this means that the deposits that they take in, then chemical has to pay for this loan to Chicago. So then chemical has less loans to make to consumers. If they reduce the discount rate, then that will increase the money supply because they have then more money because they're not paying interest on this loan. March 2020, it was 0.25%, and this is the discount rate that the Fed can increase or decrease depending on what they want to be doing with monetary policy. Reserve requirements is that thing that we talked about. We called it big letter R, and you saw it in the money multiplier where we said 1 over the required reserve ratio. So right now it's 0%. So based upon that, you probably are thinking, wow, I bet the Fed is pursuing an expansionary monetary policy right now, and they actually are, to ward off particularly COVID and some of the things that we're seeing happening right now. Now, if they increase that, if it goes up 0.25%, then it decreases the money supply, and we would call that contractionary monetary policy. Again, it's rarely used. This money multiplier stays about the same. It was first published in Modern Money Mechanics, a really great read if you ever need something to go to bed by. It's perfect. But again, banks may still decide to hold in excess of that or less than that. Actually, it can't do less than that because it's a legal minimum. But less effective in recent years because banks are starting to operate a little bit differently, perhaps a little more soundly than what they had prior to the economic collapse. The Fed can also pay interest on those reserves. So again, remember, a deposit comes in to chemical, which I have to change that example because it's not chemical anymore, it's TCF or some crazy thing. And then it goes to Chicago, right? So that's the reserve requirement. So again, they isolate 1%, the required reserve ratio of that deposit, and they send it then to the Fed. Now the Fed can increase, they can pay interest on that. And if they increase the interest rate on the reserves, that essentially will increase the reserve ratio, which means there's less money to loan back out. And because we're increasing the reserve ratio, it will affect the money multiplier, again, 1 over the required reserve ratio. And the overall effect is to decrease the money supply. There's also another term which a lot of people confuse with the discount rate. It's called the federal funds rate. And the federal funds rate is if 2 banks borrow from each other. So 2 banks. So here, for example, we'll have Fifth Third, and they're extending a loan to chemical. And why would that happen? And this is exactly why. Now, again, these are overnight loans because the Fed has to clear, all banks have to clear their books every day. And so when we look at that, the federal funds rate right now is 3.4%. Okay, again, it differs from the discount rate determined by supply and demand. because some people at Fifth Third may want a loan, whereas some additional savers might be saving at Chemical. So it's a way to transfer that out and make the whole system work the same way. Again, it's targeted by the Fed. They can change the federal funds rate. And again, federal funds rate is between banks. They can change that and they can halt that process, make it more difficult perhaps if they increase them or decrease them, which also changes the overall money supply. Obviously, increasing that rate, federal funds rate, increasing it basically means that we're going to decrease the money supply. If we decrease the federal funds rate, we're going to increase the money supply. Okay, now how does the Fed target this? Well, instead of just simply changing the rates, which they don't do very often, they use a demand and supply process. So the Fed will actually use open market operations, again, the buying and selling. And here's the effects. If they buy the bonds, just like we looked at a few slides ago, it'll decrease the federal funds rate and increase the money supply. So they're decreasing the demand, they're increasing the supply. Here, if they increase the federal funds rate, then they are increasing the demand, which is decreasing the supply because they move opposite one another. Okay, so what are the three tools of the Fed? Because I've given you lots and lots of definitions here. First one, open market operations. That's the buying and selling of bonds. If the Fed sells bonds, that decreases the money supply. We're going to learn in some upcoming chapters that if we decrease the money supply, as you decrease the money supply, the value of money goes up. Of a dollar increases because the less you have of something, the greater its value. What we know then is because it increases the value, then we can look at that in terms of what happens with inflation. And that's what we're going to do in some upcoming chapters. And we'll revisit this slide to add more to it. If the Fed buys bonds, the effect is increasing the money supply. The value of a dollar decreases. Okay. Required reserve ratio, again, we don't really change that a whole lot, but remember that's our R in the money multiplier, 1 over the required reserve ratio. This is the amount that the Federal Reserve banks have to put on deposit at the Fed every time they take in a deposit. So if we increase the required reserve ratio, then we're decreasing the money supply. And again, we have the same thing happening up here. The value of a dollar increases. If we decrease the required reserve ratio, we increase the money supply and the value of a dollar decreases. The discount rate, again, we talked about how much we use these things, not quite so much, but the discount rate, if we increase the discount rate, then we're going to decrease the money supply. And again, we have the same thing happening up here, which increases the value of money. If we decrease the rate, we're going to increase the money supply. And when we increase the money supply, it decreases the value of a dollar. So in our upcoming chapters, what we're going to talk about is, what does this mean to inflation? Because we're going to take a look at the value of a dollar is contrary, directly opposite of the price level, and price level would be our inflation. Okay, so that is the end of this objective, and I will see you back in objective 8, where we talk about why the Fed doesn't have a precise control on the money supply. Until then, have a good day.